Under the weight of a sky heavy with storm clouds, the cliff jutted out like the jagged edge of a broken sword, overlooking an endless drop into black waters that churned with the restless fury of the sea. She stood there, her breath ragged, chest burning, every muscle screaming for rest but unable to surrender because surrender meant death. The wind whipped at her hair, salt spray stung her eyes, and the stench of blood, her blood and that of others, hung in the air like a suffocating perfume of violence. Hours ago she had been part of a group, soldiers and civilians alike, scrambling for survival against an enemy that seemed to rise out of nowhere, relentless, merciless, and organized in a way that chilled her deeper than the storm ever could. Now they were all gone. Abandoned wasn't even the right word. She had watched them fall, one by one, screaming into the abyss below, cut down by bullets, torn apart by shrapnel, or simply slipping into nothingness when the crumbling edge of the cliff gave way beneath their feet. Alone, she was the last one standing, and in her trembling hands was a rifle that felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried, not because of the weapon itself but because inside its chamber, rattling quietly like a cruel reminder of fate, was a single bullet. Just one. Her lifeline, her curse, her impossible choice. The enemy was coming. She could hear them even over the roar of the waves, boots pounding against wet earth, voices barking orders, the metallic rhythm of magazines snapping into place. They were sweeping the ridge, hunting for survivors, and they knew one had escaped. She pressed her back against the cold stone, the cliff wall scraping into her skin through her torn uniform, and tried to steady her mind. One bullet. It was supposed to be her mercy, her way out, the last card of a soldier who refuses capture. That had been drilled into her long before this day. When you have nothing left, when there is no hope, save the bullet for yourself. But tonight, as thunder cracked overhead and lightning lit up the silhouettes of armed figures closing in, she felt something inside her shift. Death would be too easy. Too selfish. Somewhere out there, beyond the cliff and beyond the choking forest that stretched inland, there were people depending on her. Not soldiers, not commanders, but children, families, the fragile remnants of a village that had been targeted for annihilation. She could not let the enemy sweep past this ridge and find them. One bullet. How could one bullet stop an army? She tightened her grip on the rifle and remembered the faces of those who had fallen beside her. Faces smeared with mud and fear, yet shining with the stubborn defiance that had kept them fighting. They had bought her this moment, paid for it with their lives, and if she wasted it on her own escape, their sacrifice would mean nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her body trembling with exhaustion and blood loss, but her mind sharpened into a strange, crystalline focus. The sound of boots grew louder, closer, and the first dark shapes began to emerge from the tree line, weapons raised, eyes scanning. She knew they would find her in seconds, knew that her chances of survival were laughable. But survival wasn't the goal anymore. That bullet wasn't meant for her, not anymore. If she could place it right, if she could make it count, it could become something greater. Her lifeline could become theirs. She crouched low, adjusting the rifle against her shoulder, and aimed through the broken scope. Rain poured down the glass, blurring the view, but lightning flared again, and in that split second of brilliance she saw him, the enemy commander, striding forward at the center of the formation, shouting orders, his men moving like extensions of his will. Kill him and the chain breaks. Chaos erupts. Maybe enough time for the others, for the families hidden deep in the forest, to escape. Her finger hovered over the trigger, and the weight of the world pressed down on that single decision. One shot, one chance, everything balanced on the razor's edge. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself against the tremors in her body, whispering to the storm, to the dead, to the ones waiting for salvation. Then she squeezed, the crack of the rifle tore through the storm like a blade, a single sound swallowed instantly by thunder yet sharp enough to ripple through every soldier on that ridge. The bullet flew truer than she dared hope, slicing through the rain and striking its mark with ruthless precision. The commander jerked backward, his voice cut short, body collapsing into the mud as chaos detonated among his men. For one frozen moment, the enemy formation staggered, their momentum broken, disbelief written on every face. Then came the shouting, panicked and disorganized, men scrambling to figure out where the shot had come from, others dropping to their knees beside their fallen leader. Her breath caught in her throat, not from relief but from the terrifying realization that she had traded her own escape for something larger, something far more dangerous. One bullet, one chance, and she had taken it, but now she had nothing left. She pulled back into the shadow of the cliff wall, heart hammering, every nerve raw and on fire. They would come for her now. They had to. She could already hear the shift in their tone, not just rage but fear, because when a leader falls, soldiers are left naked against the storm. She had given them that fracture, that hesitation, and she clung to the hope that somewhere beyond the forest, the families who depended on her would feel the ripple of this chaos like an unseen shield. But hope didn't change the fact that her rifle was empty, her body broken, and her enemies many. The enemy's fury rose like a tide. They fanned out, some firing wildly into the rocks, others circling to cut off escape routes. She pressed her cheek against the cold stone and willed herself invisible, her breath shallow, her body still, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. No weapon, no reinforcements, nowhere left to run. Yet surrender was not an option. She thought of her comrades again, the way they had fallen, the way their eyes had begged her to keep going even when their voices could no longer form the words. She thought of the children's faces back in the village, eyes wide with trust, not understanding the war that hunted them but clinging to the idea that someone out there was protecting them. That someone was her. And so she forced herself to move. Crawling through the jagged rocks, she slipped along the cliff's edge, the ocean roaring below like an invitation to end it all quickly. Every shift of her body sent pain screaming through her ribs, but she bit down hard, tasting blood, and kept going. A flare of light burst above the trees, the enemy signaling to each other, and a wave of bullets tore into the stone around her, chips flying, sparks snapping. They knew she was there. They didn't know she was empty. She prayed they never would. In her crawl, her fingers brushed against the mud and closed on something unexpected, metal, cold and jagged. She pulled it free, a grenade, half buried, likely dropped from one of her fallen allies earlier. The pin was still intact, the casing dented but usable. For a moment she just stared, rain dripping from her lashes, heart thundering with the sudden cruel twist of fate. She had no bullets but she had this. Salvation or damnation wrapped in steel. Her enemies shouted again, closer now, boots pounding on the wet earth as they advanced in formation. She curled her fingers around the grenade, pressing it to her chest like it was the last heartbeat she could claim. But she hesitated. If she used it now, she could take a handful of them with her, maybe buy another few seconds for the hidden families. But if she waited, if she timed it right, she could ignite something far larger than a handful of deaths. She could collapse the cliff, drag them all into the sea, turn their advantage into their grave. That was the gamble. That was her new bullet. She steadied her breathing again, even as her vision blurred from exhaustion, even as the edges of the world grew faint. Every second mattered, and she measured them not in heartbeats but in footsteps, the pounding march of enemies closing in, hunting her like wolves scenting blood. She thought of her mother's voice, soft in memory, telling her that a single choice can change the course of fate. And so she waited, her hand tight around the grenade, her mind focused not on her own survival but on the promise that no matter what happened next, she would not let this ridge fall without taking the darkness with her. She whispered to herself, to the storm, to the ghosts beside her, and prepared to pull the pin. Her fingers tightened around the grenade until her knuckles burned white, and for a moment she thought the storm itself held its breath with her. The enemy's boots hammered against the soaked ground, closing in, their shouts ricocheting off stone and sea, a chorus of rage and confusion. The commander's death had rattled them, but they were still too many, still too armed, and she was just one broken figure on the edge of the world. Yet she had the grenade, and in its metal weight lay a decision that could carve history into the bones of this cliff. She could feel the pin biting against her thumb, a cold whisper of finality, and every instinct screamed that this was her last moment, her last stand. But even as she crouched in the jagged shadows, her mind calculated the ground, the angle of the rocks, the thunder of the waves below. The cliff was eroding, fractured by years of storms, trembling now under the combined assault of nature and war. If she could bring it down, if she could time the explosion to rip through its fault lines, then the cliff itself could become her weapon, a landslide of stone and death that no army could withstand. The thought ignited something fierce inside her, a glimmer of purpose sharper than fear. She crawled closer to the edge, the abyss yawning below, spray slapping her face as the sea hurled itself against stone. Behind her, the soldiers were nearly upon her. She could hear the click of safeties, the rush of boots splitting into squads. She pressed her body against the ground, slowing her breath, steadying her grip. She knew the cost. Pull the pin, ignite the fall, and there would be no chance to escape. She would be swallowed along with them, her body scattered across the sea. But what was her life compared to theirs, compared to the dozens of villagers hidden in the forest who had no weapons, no training, no hope except for the chaos she might deliver here? She closed her eyes for the briefest heartbeat and pictured their faces, children clutching mothers, elders whispering prayers, families huddled in silence as gunfire echoed nearer. They didn't know her name, most of them, but they would remember that someone had stood for them, that someone had turned a single bullet into a shield broad enough to cover them all. That was enough. That had to be enough. She pulled the pin. The metallic snap was drowned instantly by the roar of thunder, and she hurled the grenade not at the soldiers but into the trembling veins of the cliff itself. For a fraction of a second, nothing. Then the world cracked. The explosion tore into the stone like a spear of fire, splitting it open, ripping through the cliff's ancient fractures. The ground shuddered beneath her body, a violent convulsion that nearly flung her into the abyss. Soldiers screamed as the earth betrayed them, as massive slabs of rock sheared away and plunged into the sea with a sound like the end of the world. The ocean rose in fury, waves swallowing men whole, dragging them into the black depths. Guns fired wildly, but their bullets were swallowed by the collapse, by the chaos of stone and water. She clung desperately to a jagged outcrop, nails splitting, muscles screaming as the cliff disintegrated beneath her. The grenade had done its work and more. The ridge itself was collapsing into ruin, devouring the enemy in its wrath. Dust and spray blinded her, filled her lungs, choked her with grit and salt. She couldn't see how many had fallen, couldn't hear over the thunder whether any survived, but she felt the tremor ripple outward like a wave of freedom, clearing a path for those hiding inland. Her own body was battered, slammed against stone as pieces broke away, leaving her dangling over nothing, the abyss clawing at her heels. Her grip weakened, her strength failing, and for one agonizing heartbeat she wondered if this was the end after all, if she would be swallowed like the rest, her story lost in the sea's hunger. But then through the chaos she felt a ledge beneath her boots, narrow and slick, but enough to hold. She dropped onto it, chest heaving, body trembling, clinging to the cliff face as the last of the enemy screamed into the depths below. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the endless roar of the storm. She coughed, spat blood, wiped her face with trembling hands and looked back. The ridge was gone. Where once an army had advanced, there was now only ruin, waves crashing over the wreckage of stone and men. She had done it. She had turned one bullet into an avalanche, a lifeline carved in fire and stone. But as she slumped against the wall, fighting to breathe, she knew this wasn't the end. The army that hunted them was larger than this company, and word of what happened here would spread. They would come again, stronger, angrier, determined to finish what had begun. She had bought time, nothing more. But sometimes time was everything. She forced herself to climb, hands bleeding, body weak, dragging herself up the fractured rock until she collapsed at the top, sprawled on the shattered ground. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in the distance, and in that moment she swore she saw a flicker of movement, a signal of life. Someone had seen the collapse, someone knew what she had done. She smiled faintly, though her lips bled, and whispered into the storm, "Run." "What? Don't waste this." Then, with the taste of blood and salt on her tongue, she pushed herself to her feet, ready to face whatever came next. Her legs barely obeyed her, trembling with every step as she staggered away from the cliff's broken edge, but sheer will forced her forward into the forest's embrace. The air here was different, heavy with wet earth and pine, muffling the storm above as though the trees themselves tried to shield her. Every breath was fire in her lungs, every heartbeat a drum of exhaustion, but she refused to collapse. She had destroyed a piece of the enemy, yes, but the war was not won, and if she fell now all that sacrifice would be wasted. The village was still out there, hidden among roots and shadows, waiting for her to return. She stumbled over roots slick with rain, catching herself against trunks, blood streaking down her arms from cuts and scrapes she had stopped feeling. Her ears strained against the night, listening not only for the storm but for the sound of pursuit. The collapse would have killed most but not all. There was always a survivor, always someone stubborn enough or lucky enough to crawl free, and she knew the enemy's network was vast. News of the ridge would travel fast and vengeance would come with it. Her only advantage was time, a small flame she had ignited with her defiance. She pressed deeper into the forest, guided by instinct more than memory, though the path felt familiar. They had hidden caches along these routes, supplies buried under marked stones, signals etched into bark. She prayed they hadn't been discovered, prayed that the forest still held secrets for her to claim. After what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, she found one, a hollow tree marked with 3 slashes at its base. She fell to her knees, clawed at the wet soil, and unearthed a tin box. Inside, a small canteen, a strip of dried meat, a flare gun with 2 cartridges, and a single pistol with half a magazine. Her hands shook as she cradled the weapon. Not much, but after the emptiness of her rifle it felt like salvation. She loaded it carefully, each click steadying her heartbeat, reminding her she was not finished yet. She devoured the meat despite the knots in her stomach, gulped water until her throat loosened, then wiped her mouth and forced herself upright again. The flare gun she tucked into her belt, not for rescue but for signals. There were still allies scattered across the land, fighters who might see the light and know she lived, know the fight wasn't over. The pistol she held in her hand, the weight of it reassuring, though she knew bullets alone could not win. Her strength had to be in more than weapons. It had to be in resolve. The forest thickened, branches clawing at her uniform, mud sucking at her boots. She moved slower now, deliberately, weaving her trail to confuse anyone who followed. Her mind drifted, not in weakness but in memory, replaying the moment on the cliff, the shattering of stone, the cries of men swallowed by the sea. She should have died with them. Every rational thought told her so. Yet she hadn't. Something had spared her, something had given her this fragile continuation, and she could not waste it. She thought of the villagers again, their faces more vivid than the storm. An old man with trembling hands who had whispered to her once, "You are our shield." A child who had tugged at her sleeve, asking if the bad men would ever come near their homes. She had promised protection, and now she understood that promise was not a shield at all. It was a fire, something that had to burn through her veins even when her body failed. She pressed on, the promise keeping her upright when exhaustion nearly buckled her knees. Then through the trees she saw movement, a flicker of light, faint but deliberate. She froze, pistol raised, heart hammering. The forest held dangers on both sides. It could be the enemy or it could be her people. Slowly she crept closer, weaving between trunks, every muscle taut with readiness. As she drew near, she heard whispers, low and hurried. Her grip tightened and she stepped into a clearing. Gasps met her. Not soldiers, families. Half a dozen of them huddled around a dim lantern shielded under coats, eyes wide with terror until recognition softened them. Children clung to their mothers, and the men who stood guard with axes and hunting knives lowered their arms as they realized who she was. Relief broke across their faces, mingled with disbelief, as though a ghost had walked into their circle. She lowered her pistol, chest heaving, and for the first time since the cliff, her knees gave out. They rushed to her, hands catching her before she hit the ground, voices overlapping, asking if she was hurt, what had happened, where the others were. She could barely speak past the dryness of her throat, but she forced the words out. "The ridge is gone. They're not coming, not tonight." Murmurs spread like wind through the group, hope sparking where there had only been dread. A mother kissed her child's head, whispering prayers of thanks. A man gripped her shoulder, tears streaking through the mud on his cheeks. She wanted to rest, to let the darkness take her, but she knew this was not safety, not yet. She dragged herself upright again, leaning on their support, and told them what they needed to hear. "We have to move. This place won't stay hidden. We go deeper. We survive." And though she was broken, bleeding, and weary beyond words, when they looked at her, they nodded. They would follow. The forest swallowed them as they moved, a ragged procession of the weary and desperate led by a soldier who could barely stand yet refused to fall. She walked at the front, pistol steady in her hand, every sense straining against the night. The villagers followed in silence, their lantern extinguished, their footsteps muffled by the wet earth. Children were carried against shoulders, their small breaths damp against the storm, while the elders leaned on one another, determined to match the pace despite trembling legs. The rain had softened into a mist beneath the trees, but the cold clung to them, numbing fingers and hearts alike. She kept them moving, whispering instructions and gestures more than words, teaching them how to place their feet, how to duck beneath branches, how to stop when her hand lifted. This was no simple walk, it was survival, every second stolen from the jaws of hunters. She could feel the weight of pursuit behind them, faint at first, then sharper as time dragged on. The enemy had not been destroyed entirely at the cliff. Some had lived and others were surely on their way. She knew how armies thought, how vengeance carried them forward like fire. They would search the forest, scour every shadow, and when they came upon tracks in the mud, the chase would begin in earnest. They needed distance, and more than distance they needed strategy. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind sharpened into clarity born of desperation. She could not simply lead them deeper, she had to lead them smarter. She guided them toward higher ground, where roots twisted into natural barricades and streams cut across the land to wash away their scent. At one point she dropped to her knees, smearing mud across her boots and urging the others to do the same, erasing the brightness of bare skin, dulling them into shadows of the forest itself. They obeyed without question, their faith in her growing with every step, though none dared voice it aloud. Hours stretched like days. The forest grew thicker, darker, branches like claws snagging their clothes. Every sound, a snapped twig, a rustle in the undergrowth, tightened their fear until it became a living thing coiled around them. Once they heard voices too close, enemy scouts slicing through the trees. She pressed a finger to her lips, dropped to the ground, and motioned for the others to do the same. They lay in the mud, holding their breath as boots thudded mere feet away. A child whimpered, muffled quickly against a mother's chest, and for a heartbeat she thought it would all unravel here, that the forest would betray them. But the soldiers passed, their torches bobbing into the distance, unaware of the ghosts lying silent in the dirt. Only when the last ember of light had vanished did she rise again, and though her knees shook with the effort, her eyes burned with renewed fire. The villagers saw it too. That night, though they were soaked and freezing, though their stomachs gnawed with hunger, a shift had taken root among them. Fear still clung to their bones, but hope had found a place alongside it. They were not wandering aimlessly. They had a guide, a shield, someone who had stood at the edge of death and still walked forward. For the first time in weeks, their steps did not feel like retreat, they felt like resistance. Still, she knew it was fragile, this thread of survival. They could not keep running forever. The forest could hide them for a time, but the enemy would not rest. She needed more than escape, she needed a plan. As dawn's gray light seeped through the canopy, she brought them to a narrow gorge where the rocks formed a natural shelter. Here, the trees arched so thick overhead that even smoke would be hidden if they dared a small fire. The villagers collapsed, exhaustion claiming them, but she remained alert, pacing the perimeter with pistol in hand. Every sound in the forest pressed against her ears, every shift of the wind carrying warnings. Her body begged for sleep, but she refused. She could not afford weakness, not when lives depended on her strength. Yet as she watched the families huddled together, whispering comfort to one another, a realization struck her like a blade. She was not simply protecting them, she was becoming something more in their eyes. To them she was not just a soldier. She was proof that one person's defiance could hold back an army, that courage could bloom even in ruin. It was a burden heavier than any weapon she had carried, yet it anchored her more firmly than fear ever could. As night fell again, she gathered the small group around her, voice low but steady, telling them what they needed to hear. We cannot keep running. We must prepare. They will come again, and when they do, we will not scatter, we will stand. I will teach you. The villagers listened, hesitant but drawn by her conviction. She spoke of traps laid in silence, of signals passed in whispers, of fighting not as soldiers but as survivors who refused to be erased. Their eyes widened at first, then hardened with resolve. They were farmers, hunters, mothers, fathers, children, but beneath the weight of desperation she saw sparks ignite. She had turned one bullet into an avalanche on the cliff. Now she would turn this frightened cluster into a firestorm hidden in the trees. She began at dawn, when the forest was still damp with mist and the villagers stirred with stiff limbs and hollow stomachs. They gathered in a circle around her, uncertain but willing, eyes drawn to the pistol at her hip as though it was a talisman. She didn't waste time with speeches. Speeches would not teach them how to live. Instead, she crouched low and showed them how to move silently through undergrowth, how to use the trees as cover, how to read the ground for tracks. She pressed their hands to the earth, guided their fingers over broken twigs, pointed to the direction mud had been pressed by boots. The children watched wide-eyed, absorbing every motion. The hunters among them caught on quickly, their instincts blending easily with the lessons of war. Soon she had them weaving through the trees without sound, ghosts where before they had been stumbling prey. Then she showed them how to fight, not with guns because there weren't enough but with what they had. She stripped branches into spears, showed how to sharpen stakes and bury them where an enemy's foot might land. She took wire from the caches she found and strung it low between trees to trip the unwary. She taught them to dig shallow pits camouflaged with leaves, to turn the forest itself into a weapon. Every hand worked, every mind bent toward survival, and though their faces were pale with fear, their bodies grew sharper, more confident with each hour. At night, by the dim glow of a shielded fire, she spoke of discipline. You cannot think of yourselves as victims, she told them, voice quiet but hard as steel. You are the forest. When they enter, you close around them. You strike then vanish. Never meet them head-on. Let them bleed into the roots. The villagers nodded, and she could see the fire catch in their eyes. Not soldiers, no, but defenders sharpened by necessity. The children were given roles too, signal runners, watchers in the trees, carrying whistles made from reeds to warn of danger. Even the elders had purpose, weaving snares, tending small fires for smoke signals. She gave them all something because the greatest weapon they had was unity. Days blurred into nights, the forest alive with whispered drills and hidden preparations. Her wounds slowly knit, though pain never left her. She carried it like a constant reminder of what was at stake. Fatigue gnawed at her, but when she saw the villagers moving with practiced silence, when she watched a boy no older than 10 string a bow with steady hands, she felt strength return in ways no rest could provide. Yet danger was never far. Scouts passed through the forest often now, searching for signs, their torches weaving like fireflies of death. Each time, she froze the group, pressed them into silence, and waited until the enemy had passed. Once, when a patrol strayed too close, she led a handful of villagers in an ambush. They struck fast, spears plunging from the shadows, knives flashing in the rain. The fight was brutal, clumsy, but it ended with enemy bodies buried under roots and stolen rifles hidden in their camp. The victory was small, but its effect was enormous. For the first time, the villagers saw blood spilled by their own hands, not in helplessness but in defiance. Fear had not vanished, it never would, but it had been reshaped into resolve. Word of the collapse at the cliff had spread beyond the soldiers who survived. She overheard scraps of their conversations as they moved through the woods, rage and superstition mingling in their voices. They spoke of a phantom, a ghost woman who had slaughtered men and buried an army in the sea. They feared her in whispers, and though she knew the truth was smaller, she let the myth grow. Fear was a weapon too, and if they thought her more than human, it would serve her people well. But the enemy adapted, sending larger forces into the forest, moving slower, methodical, burning swaths of land to flush them out. The villagers looked to her with questions they didn't voice. Could they withstand what was coming? Could one woman's fire keep them alive against the tide? She never answered directly. Instead, she gave them tasks, kept their hands busy, their minds sharp, because hesitation was the crack through which despair seeped. At night, when she lay awake listening to the forest breathe, she admitted to herself the truth. They could not win in numbers. They could only win in time. Every day they lived, every enemy they slowed, bought another heartbeat for the village hidden deeper inland, another chance for someone to survive this war. And so she steeled herself, binding her fate to theirs, knowing there was no path left to retreat. She had become their shield, their teacher, their myth. She would not let the myth die quietly. The forest awoke with fire. At dawn the sky glowed red, not from the sun but from the torches of hundreds sweeping through the trees, their shouts cutting through mist and birdsong alike. She had feared this day, prepared for it, and now it had come. The enemy had unleashed a massive sweep, determined to crush the phantom that haunted their nights and the villagers she protected. The ground shook with their numbers, boots pounding like a storm across the earth, steel and rifles gleaming between the trunks. The villagers huddled in silence within their hidden gorge, eyes wide, clutching the crude weapons she had taught them to wield. She stood at the entrance, pistol in one hand, knife in the other, body taut with the calm before a storm. This was not a patrol they could simply hide from. This was the reckoning. She crouched low, whispering her commands, her voice steady though her blood raced. Remember what I taught you. Do not fight where they are strongest. Strike and vanish. The forest is ours. Let it bleed them before they ever see us. They nodded, fear shimmering in their eyes, but resolve burning deeper. Even the children knew their roles now, perched in trees with whistles ready, eyes sharp as hawks. The first wave of soldiers entered the gorge, their torches casting cruel light across the rocks. She signaled, and the villagers vanished into shadows as though swallowed by the earth. The enemy advanced cautiously, rifles raised, scanning the brush. Then the first trap snapped, stakes hidden beneath leaves driving into legs, screams shattering the tense silence. Before the soldiers could regroup, arrows whistled from above, crude but deadly, striking into throats and shoulders. Panic rippled through their formation, and in that heartbeat she struck, darting from the trees like a shadow, her pistol barking 3 precise shots. 3 men fell, and before the others could turn, she was gone again, melting back into the forest. The villagers moved with her, emboldened by her presence, striking from angles the soldiers could not predict. Spears flashed, knives stabbed from behind trunks, then vanished. The forest erupted with chaos, the disciplined line of the enemy unraveling against an enemy they could not pin down. But numbers carried weight, and for every soldier who fell, more pressed forward. The air filled with gunfire, wood splintering, the earth churning with explosions as grenades tore holes into the undergrowth. She felt the sting of shrapnel cut across her arm but did not falter, dragging a boy to safety as he nearly froze in terror. "Move!" she barked, pushing him forward, and the sound of her voice snapped him back into action. Whistles shrilled from the treetops, signaling flanks moving in, guiding villagers through the storm like invisible threads of command. For hours, the battle pulsed and shifted, the villagers fighting like shadows, the forest itself seeming to resist the invaders. Yet exhaustion crept into their limbs, fear threatening to overwhelm resolve. She could see it in their eyes each time they stumbled back to her side, the question unspoken: how long could they last? Her pistol's magazine dwindled, each shot measured like the last drops of water in a desert. She used her knife more now, close and brutal, fighting not like a soldier on a battlefield but like an animal cornered, fierce and unyielding. And still the tide pressed forward. Smoke thickened, torches spreading fire through undergrowth, the enemy determined to burn them out if they could not flush them by force. Flames crackled, heat rising, choking the air. She knew then the forest itself might betray them, might turn from shield to pyre. A decision had to be made. She gathered the villagers in a moment's lull, their faces streaked with mud and sweat, their breaths ragged. "We cannot hold them here," she said, her voice steady though her heart raged. "But we can break them. We can make them pay so dearly they fear these woods forever. One strike, then we vanish." They listened, clinging to her words, the fire of her certainty giving them strength. She led them toward a ravine where the ground narrowed into a choke point, roots and stones forming a natural funnel. There, she had them prepare their final ambush, logs loosened to roll, oil-soaked rags ready to ignite, stakes hidden just beyond sight. As the enemy pressed forward, she stood at the center, pistol raised, waiting. The first line of soldiers entered the ravine, confident, their numbers swelling, voices shouting victory too soon. Then she fired her last bullet into the rags, flames leaping high, and the trap erupted. Logs thundered down, crushing men beneath their weight. Fire roared through the narrow path, smoke choking the air. Screams echoed, chaos spreading like a virus through the enemy's ranks. Spears and arrows rained down, knives flashing from shadows. It was not a battle now, it was slaughter, the forest itself closing teeth upon invaders. Yet she did not allow herself to savor it. She knew the cost. This was their moment to break free, not to stand triumphant. As the ravine burned and the enemy reeled, she signaled retreat, her voice carrying above the inferno. "Go. Into the deep forest. Now." The villagers obeyed, vanishing into shadows, carrying children, supporting elders. She remained until the last had passed, pistol now empty, knife slick with blood, her eyes fixed on the inferno that had become their shield. The enemy had been broken but not destroyed. They would return more furious than ever. But tonight she had shown them the price of their hunt. She turned and followed her people, every step heavy, every breath searing, yet her spirit unbroken. The phantom still lived, and as long as she breathed, the villagers would not fall. They moved deeper into the forest, away from the smoke and screams of the ravine, every step fueled by the raw instinct to survive. The villagers stumbled with exhaustion, but their eyes carried something new, an ember of defiance, lit by the chaos they had unleashed. She walked at the rear, knife in one hand, the empty pistol still holstered at her side like a symbol. Her body ached, her wounds throbbed, yet her gaze remained sharp, scanning every shadow for signs of pursuit. She knew the enemy would not stop. They would gather, reorganize, and come again with greater fury. What she had given the villagers was not safety, only time. And yet, as dawn broke through the canopy, scattering light across their weary faces, she felt the first fragile taste of victory. They were still alive. That alone was defiance. She led them to a hidden glade, where a stream ran clear and the trees arched like guardians overhead. Here she allowed them to rest. Mothers laid children in the grass, men slumped against roots, elders closed their eyes with whispers of thanks. She stood apart, unable to rest, her body vibrating with the awareness of danger. In the stillness, her thoughts wandered, not to herself but to the bullet she had fired on the cliff, the moment that had changed everything. That single shot had toppled a commander, fractured an army, and begun a chain of resistance that now pulsed through these villagers. It had not been a lifeline for her. It had become theirs. The memory steadied her, reminding her that one act, no matter how small, could shift the course of fate. But fate was not finished testing them. As the sun rose higher, she heard the distant crack of gunfire, faint but undeniable. Scouts had found their trail. She felt the weight of inevitability settle on her shoulders. There would be no endless running, no hidden corner of the forest untouched forever. If the villagers were to survive, there had to be an end, a strike so decisive it would break the enemy's will to pursue. Her mind raced through possibilities, eyes scanning the terrain. The stream ran into a narrow gorge a short distance away, its banks steep and treacherous. If the enemy followed in force, the gorge could become a trap far greater than the ravine. She pictured it, the enemy funneled into the narrow path, the villagers striking from above with fire, rocks, and stolen rifles. It would be costly, but it could end the chase at least for now. She gathered the villagers, her voice low but firm, laying out the plan. Fear flickered in their eyes, but so did determination. They had already fought, already bled. Now they would fight again, not as prey but as hunters defending their lives. Together they moved to the gorge, working quickly, their hands sure despite trembling muscles. They rolled boulders into place, sharpened stakes, soaked rags in oil from scavenged tins. Children carried messages along the ridge, elders prepared hiding places for the youngest. She directed it all with the precision of a commander, though inside she felt the tremors of exhaustion threatening to shatter her. Still she stood tall because they needed her to. By dusk the trap was ready. And not a moment too soon. The forest trembled with the approach of soldiers, their voices echoing through the gorge, confident in their numbers, certain of victory. She crouched at the edge, villagers beside her, each clutching weapon or stone, waiting for her signal. The first line of soldiers entered, torches casting light across the water. She felt her breath steady, her heart slow, her mind sharpen. This was the moment. She lifted her hand, then brought it down. Fire ignited the rags, rolling boulders thundered, arrows and bullets poured from above. The gorge became an inferno, the screams of men drowned by the roar of flames and the crash of stone. The enemy tried to fight back, rifles firing blindly into the ridges, but the villagers were gone before the shots found them, striking from another angle, then vanishing again. The forest itself seemed to rise in rebellion, every root and stone turning against the invaders. She moved through it all like a phantom, knife flashing, pistol now stolen from a fallen soldier cracking with new rounds. Every strike was precise, every motion born of desperate necessity. She was everywhere at once, or so it seemed to the enemy, and the myth of the ghost woman grew in their terror. The battle raged until night swallowed the sky, until torches sputtered out and the gorge was filled with the dead and the dying. At last, silence returned, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the labored breaths of survivors. She stood among the villagers, bloodied but unbroken, her knife dripping, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. They had won. Not just survived, won. The enemy had been shattered here, their will broken, their pursuit ended. For now at least the villagers were safe. She sank to her knees, exhaustion finally crushing her, but hands reached out to steady her, voices whispering gratitude, reverence. They called her savior, protector, ghost. She shook her head, whispering hoarsely, "Not me. All of us." Yet in her heart she knew the truth. It had begun with her, with one bullet on a cliff that had become a lifeline for everyone. And though the war was not over, though more battles loomed beyond the horizon, she understood something vital in that moment. Courage was not measured in armies or weapons. It was measured in the choice to stand when standing seemed impossible, to fight when the world demanded surrender. She looked at the faces around her, children smeared with ash, mothers gripping knives, elders standing tall despite wounds, and saw not fear but strength. They would endure. She had given them that. As dawn returned once more, washing the forest in pale light, she rose unsteadily to her feet. The pistol at her side was heavy, the knife in her hand slick, but her voice was steady as she spoke to them. They will come again. And when they do we will be ready. Because we are not prey. We are the storm. And in that moment the villagers believed it, not because she had said it but because she had shown it. The phantom of the cliff had become more than a myth. She had become a spark, and the fire she lit would burn long after the last bullet was spent. The end.